the Athenian hero of the Greco-Persian War, the man who devised the tactic that tricked the Persian navy into an ambush, the man who set Athens on a course of naval dominance. Themistocles was ostracized in circa 471 BCE from the very city he served so dearly for so long. The reasons behind Themistocles' ostracism are far from simple. Sure, he was becoming too arrogant, and sure, he was accused of taking bribes, but his ostracism was also part of a greater political battle happening in Athens at the time. In the 470s and 460s, the two most prominent political debates or movements in Athens could be described as the democratic movement and the conservative movement. Both factions supported the Delian League and the continuation of the war with Persia, but they disagreed about how to handle Sparta and how to run the Athenian democracy. The conservatives hoped to not necessarily ally with Sparta, but at least not anger them or antagonize them. In other words, they wanted to keep the Spartan-Athenian relations as amicable as possible. They also generally wanted a more limited democracy, with most of the political power resting in the hands of the quote, better classes, or in other words, the upper classes. The Democrats, on the other hand, wanted to hinder the Spartan expansion of power, and in general they wanted to cause as much nuisance to the Spartans as possible. The Democrats were also in favor of a more radical democracy. In other words, they wanted to divide the political power equally among all the Athenian citizens regardless of their class. With that said, Athens didn't really have political parties in the way we would understand them. As Tridimas states, in the direct democracy of Athens, assembly voters voted on each item debated, rather than platforms bundling several issues. When it is possible to vote on any single issue, the number of divisions among citizens is extremely large. Every single issue may generate a different coalition of interests. This implies that assembly voting on each policy item made impossible the emergence of stable, organized groups. The people voting for what I call the conservative movement or the democratic movement would not have seen themselves as part of some democratic or conservative faction. They were all just people voting according to their own beliefs, which were often shaped by the most prominent politicians of the time, but which, due to how the Athenian government was structured, did not lead to any organization of active political parties. A source from the late 5th century even mentions that forming political societies in Athens was illegal. With that said, despite there not being any political parties, we can, with hindsight, observe political trends and movements happening in Athens, which often revolved around the most prominent politicians of the time. So, when I talk about the conservatives or the Democrats, I'm talking about these greater political movements, not actual political parties. Anyways, for much of the 470s, Athenian politics seem to have been dominated by the democratic movement, which can be seen through the political prominence of its largest supporter at the time, Themistocles. Themistocles did all he could to hinder any kind of Spartan plans in Greece. He tricked them when they protested the rebuilding of the Athenian walls. Through diplomatic cunning, he stopped their efforts to gain political control over Delphi, and he specifically pushed for the Athenian naval buildup to contrast Sparta and its land army. According to Plutarch, he was also the champion of the common people, fighting for their democratic rights against the conservative movement. However, by the end of the 470s, a new and very prominent political player emerged in Athens, Cimon, who initially had the backing of the late champion of the upper classes, Aristides. Coming from an old aristocratic family, Cimon was a staunch conservative who wanted political power to be largely held by the upper classes. He also loved the Spartans. He had many friends and allies in Sparta and was even appointed by the Spartans as their proxenos, meaning he was chosen by the Spartans to be their official Athenian diplomat. Cimon's initial exploits and victories as the Delian League's military leader gave him much fame in Athens. After all, he conquered Thrace and Skyros, found the bones of Theseus, brought a lot of money to Athens through the slaves and booty he acquired during his conquests, and even funded many new building projects. He funded the expansion of the city's defenses and the rebuilding of the shrine of Theseus, the Athenian Academy, and the Acropolis. He also funded an overall refurbishment of the city, fixing old roads, adding new trees and gardens, and draining the swamps between Athens and Piraeus. All these military exploits and building projects made Cimon very popular in Athens, which in turn made the conservative movement, which he championed, also popular. Hence, Themistocles' ostracism in circa 471 can be seen as a pivotal moment in Athenian politics when the conservative movement, thanks largely to Cimon, started to dominate over the democratic movement. The Spartans used the fact that the conservative pro-Spartan movement was at its height in Athens to their advantage. Ever since Themistocles tricked them during the whole Athenian wall building project, they hated him with a passion and wanted to see him destroyed. So, when he was ostracized, Sparta seized the opportunity and came forth with evidence that implicated Themistocles in Pausanias' plot. Pausanias was the Spartan general accused of working with the Persian king to overthrow Greece. Athens took the Spartan accusations seriously and either tried and declared Themistocles guilty in absentia or sent soldiers to retrieve Themistocles from exile in order to be tried in Athens. The sources are unclear. All we know is that Athens did send soldiers along with some Spartan volunteers to take Themistocles into custody. Themistocles, knowing he was either already declared guilty of conspiring with the Persian king or that he would be declared guilty in the now conservative-leaning Athens, tried fleeing to various places around Greece. But every time he would arrive somewhere, he would be soon forced to leave due to the relentlessness of the soldiers hunting him. With no other choice, Themistocles decided to flee Greece entirely, to the very kingdom he was accused of conspiring with. Persia. Whether Themistocles was actually guilty, as well as Pausanias, is honestly impossible to know. After all, it all happened 2500 years ago. When Themistocles arrived in Persia, he met with the king and was said to have impressed the king so much that he was given a small governorship in Asia Minor, bordering the Ionian cities of the Delian League. Also, while all of this was happening, Themistocles' wife and kids, along with some of his possessions, were smuggled to him out of Athens by some of his friends. Themistocles would eventually die in Asia Minor while serving the Persian king as his governor, and so ended the life of one of the most well-known military tricksters of the Greco-Persian War. Meanwhile, in the Delian League, after the brief respite in the war with Persia due to the Naxian rebellion, Cimon, in circa 467, planned a Delian League expedition to, quote, liberate more Greek cities and conquer Persian ones located in Lycia and Pamphylia. In preparation for this expedition, Cimon widened the Athenian triremes in order for them to be able to hold more hoplites on their decks. So when they would board enemy ships, they would always have a numbers advantage. With about 200 of these widened triremes, Cimon set sail for Asia Minor. As the Delian League forces were conquering the coastline of today's southwestern Turkey, Cimon found that much of the Persian navy, about 350 triremes strong, was anchored at the mouth of the nearby river called Eurymedon. They were hiding from the Athenians and waiting for naval reinforcements to come from Cyprus. Cimon, hoping to defeat the Persian navy before it could be reinforced, quickly attacked the anchored navy. The Persians didn't want to fight, hoping to wait for the reinforcements, but Cimon's quick attack forced their hand, and so a battle ensued in which the widened triremes of Cimon proved extremely successful, and the Persian navy was forced to retreat, running their ships aground and fleeing to meet up with the Persian army stationed nearby. Cimon, eager to push his advantage, also disembarked his troops and proceeded to engage with the Persians. According to Diodorus, the Persian army did not expect to encounter a sizable enemy, for they thought the Greeks only had a naval force in the area and were unaware of the sizable number of hoplites on the widened triremes. Therefore, when Cimon attacked with all his disembarked hoplites, the Persians were caught off guard by their sheer numbers and promptly lost the battle. Many of the Persian sailors and soldiers were enslaved, their camp was looted, and their ships destroyed. According to Plutarch, this victory was still not enough for Cimon, who forced a portion of his navy back out to sea to confront the incoming Persian naval reinforcements. Caught off guard and unaware of what happened to the main Persian navy, the remaining Persian navy, in a confused panic, was easily defeated. With this one land and sea battle, Cimon managed to destroy most of the Persian navy, and Persia ceased to be a serious naval threat to Greece for the next 17 years. Cimon returned to Athens even more of a hero than he already was, bringing with him more slaves, more booty, and yet more expansion of the Delian League. Whether the new cities in Lycia and Pamphylia wanted to actually join the League, or were forcefully coerced by Athens to join, is hard to say, and has been a matter of debate by historians. Nevertheless, this did not matter to the Athenians, who certainly must have seen the expansion of a league of which they were a hegemon as a positive. Cimon's ever-growing popularity expanded the power of the conservative movement in Athens even more, which started to threaten the Athenian democratic system. This is because a lot of the conservatives tended to favor a limited democracy. The people who voted for the conservative agenda wanted most of the political power to be held by the upper classes, or, as Aristotle called them, the better classes, rather than sharing political power with the inexperienced rabble. This is not to say that all the conservative voting people were only from the upper classes. There certainly were poorer people that argued for the conservative cause. After all, most Athenians were not part of the upper class, so the fact that the conservative movement was so prominent must also imply some sort of support from the lower classes. Now, in order to understand what Cimon and the conservatives were doing to undermine the Athenian democracy, we must first understand the current political system of Athens, which began in the late 6th century. And to help me explain that system, here's a small but very knowledgeable history tuber, Nothing New.
Thanks, Matus. So the Athenian system of government in around 465 was built on the reforms of Cleisthenes, which were enacted around 508 to 507. Before these reforms, Athens was divided into three main factions: the shore, the hill, and the plain, which were headed by various aristocrats. This meant that a politician like Pisistratus could use his popularity to seize power and establish a single-rule tyranny, which often seemed like a preferable option compared to a city dominated by fierce rivalries between factions. These were the issues which Cleisthenes would have to solve in order to secure the democracy that Athens would become famous for. He needed to break up the traditional tribes and the strong influence of the old noble families, and he needed to find a way to stop particular politicians from gaining too much power through popularity. Cleisthenes achieved this by reforming the political system of Athens, which had existed since the earlier reforms of Solon. First, Cleisthenes abolished the 4 traditional Ionian tribes that divided Athens and reorganized the city into 10 new tribes. He did this by dividing the 3 main geographical areas into multiple smaller subdivisions, and then took the new subdivisions from each geographical area and combined them to form 10 completely new tribes. This effectively broke up the old Athenian factions and the power of the noble families. Conscription, elections, jury appointments, and more were all done through these 10 new tribes of Athens. Second, Cleisthenes gave more power to the Athenian assembly. The assembly allowed every Athenian citizen to speak their mind and vote on all matters concerning the city-state, its laws, and elected government officials. While the assembly included all citizens, we should keep in mind that this excluded women, children, foreign residents, and slaves who were denied the rights of citizenship. Under Cleisthenes, the assembly essentially became the most important branch of government in Athens. Third, Cleisthenes also gave more power to the Council of 500, known as the Boule, which guided and prepared the agenda for the assembly and functioned as the executive branch of the government. The reorganization of the tribes required Cleisthenes to expand the Boule from 400 to 500 members, with 50 members chosen annually by random selection from a group of volunteers coming from each of the 10 tribes. Fourth, Cleisthenes took away much of the power of the 9 archons, which were the chief magistrates of the city. Before Cleisthenes' reforms, the archons were the main executive branch of the government, but since Cleisthenes gave much of this power to the Boule, the archons became symbolic figureheads overseeing religious, military, and political celebrations. By the year 465, the archons, like the members of the Boule, were elected by lot from a group of 500 volunteers, again 50 from each tribe. Fifth, Cleisthenes reorganized the military, with each tribe electing an infantry commander, a cavalry commander, and most importantly, a general. The board of the 10 generals, known as strategoi, oversaw all matters relating to the Athenian military and later also the Delian League military. By the year 465, the strategoi were the only high-ranking government office in Athens that was elected by popular vote and could also serve unlimited consecutive terms. Sixth, even though the assembly served as the final appeals court for most criminal cases, Cleisthenes established a court system for minor cases where jurors were selected by lot from an annual roll of 6,000 volunteers. The Areopagus was the only branch of the Athenian government that seems to have been untouched by Cleisthenes' reforms. The Areopagus was a council of elders composed of former archons, and its main function was to scrutinize elected and government officials and to judge serious crimes such as murder. Lastly, we should touch upon the use of sortition in Athens, which was the process of choosing government officials by random selection from a group of volunteers, also known as election by lot. We don't know when the first instance of sortition occurred in Athens, but it most likely emerged at some point in the 6th century, with the largest expansion of its use taking place during Cleisthenes' reforms. Initially, historians thought that the use of sortition had a religious aspect, in the sense that the random result of the lot revealed the will of the gods. However, in recent years, a closer examination of the primary sources showed no connection between election by lot and religion, meaning that the Athenians chose sortition due to perceived practical benefits rather than religious reasons. The actual practicality of election by lot is a debate for another time, but as Hansen states, in the selection of magistrates, the Athenians preferred the lot to election because it safeguarded the powers of the people and obviated factionalism and corruption, which was yet another reason why Athens didn't have political parties. This is the general picture of Athenian government in the 5th century that scholars have been able to piece together, but we should keep in mind how much we don't know about the exact functions of the different bodies of government. This overview was pretty brief in describing the functions of the various branches of Athenian government simply because we just don't know that much about them. Our understanding of classical Athenian democracy is incomplete because it relies entirely on fragmentary inscriptions and testimonies of later writers such as Aristotle and Herodotus. It is also due to the nature of these sources that while certain reforms are attributed to legendary figures like Cleisthenes and Solon, it's hard to say whether Cleisthenes was actually responsible for instituting everything attributed to him. Nonetheless, if you want to learn more about Cleisthenes and other famous Athenian lawmakers, head over to my channel and check out the videos I made all about their lives and reforms.
Thank you, Nothing New. Definitely go check him out. As you can see, the exact functions of all the Athenian branches of government in circa 465 are not entirely known to us. However, according to Aristotle and Plutarch, during this time, Cimon and his conservative allies were using the power of specifically the Areopagus to control Athenian politics. The way they did this was simple. The Areopagus was composed of only former archons, in other words, people that already held a political position. As previously mentioned, archons were elected by lot from a group of volunteers, so in theory, any Athenian citizen could have become an archon, but there were several catches. First, none of the positions of the Athenian government were paid, meaning only people who could financially support themselves while doing their political duties could realistically volunteer to be elected by lot into government positions, which meant that much of the government ended up being filled by the upper classes, including the Areopagus. Second, one of Areopagus's powers was to, quote, scrutinize incoming government officials to ensure they were fit for the job. For example, making sure that they don't have any criminal records or that they don't have any conflict of interest with their appointed office, stuff like that. Areopagus also had the power to prosecute government officials once they were in office or even after their term ended. This power of scrutiny over the government officials when they were elected, when they were in office, and even when their office ended meant that the Areopagus, even though it couldn't control the elections, could control who would eventually become a government official, and through threats of prosecution could even control their decisions while in office. Essentially, the Areopagus, which had an upper-class majority, could control the membership of all the elected branches of government, making sure the better classes stayed in control. This political power of the Areopagus became increasingly utilized by Cimon and his conservative allies in the late 470s and early 460s. According to Aristotle, during this time, the Areopagus had the superintendence of affairs of Athens. With that said, no matter how much political control Cimon and the conservatives had through the Areopagus, they still could not control the most important branch of the Athenian government, the assembly. The assembly was where every Athenian citizens could voice their opinion regardless of rank or status, and it was here that the democratic movement, which has been in decline since the ostracism of Themistocles, found two new, quote, leaders of the people, Ephialtes and Pericles. Both men came onto the political stage in the 460s as Athenian strategoi, and they increasingly started to be vocal in the assembly against Cimon, the conservatives, and the overreach of power by the Areopagus. Ephialtes was initially the more successful democratic politician out of the two because, unlike Pericles, who had an upper-class background, Ephialtes, according to Aelian, came from extreme poverty and so could connect with the common people better than Pericles could. Since Cimon was the head of the Delian League military, he was often away from Athens on military expeditions, and it was these intermittent absences of Cimon that Pericles and Ephialtes exploited. For example, when Cimon, after the Battle of Eurymedon, went to quote, liberate the cities of the Sea of Marmara, Pericles and Ephialtes used Cimon's absence to attack him and the conservatives with everything they could think of. From basic slander like stating that Cimon was sleeping with his sister, to more serious crimes like charges of bribery or accusations of undermining the Athenian democracy. However, despite these efforts by the new leaders of the democratic movement, conservatives still retained control of the Athenian government, mostly due to the still tremendous popularity of Cimon. But popularity in the public's eyes doesn't last forever, especially when Ares and Poseidon were eager to test just how popular Cimon was, for a new war and a natural disaster were just around the corner. These Athenian videos never do that well, but I really enjoy the history of classical Athens, and that's why I keep making them. Plus, there seems to be a small community of my subscribers that does like these videos, so these ones are for you guys. Also, please go check out Nothing New, link in the description, he has a great little channel. Other than that, thank you so much to my patrons, and special thanks to my deity tier patrons, Rohan, Crafty Criminalist, and Brian Lafata. As always, my name is MLaser, and stick around for history.